You think medieval torture was bad? Wait until you hear what the Byzantine emperors did to their own palace servants. We're not talking about quick executions or standard punishments here. We're talking about systematic, calculated cruelty that lasted for centuries, performed on the very people who were supposed to serve them most loyally. The eunuchs of Constantinople lived through horrors that make Game of Thrones look like a children's bedtime story. Picture this. It's the year 532 CE, and Emperor Justinian has just discovered that his most trusted advisor, a eunuch named Stephanus, has been secretly corresponding with Persian spies. What happens next isn't just an execution. It's a three-day spectacle of creative torture that ends with Stephanus being transformed into something that barely resembles a human being. And that's just Tuesday in the Byzantine court. But here's what your history textbooks never told you. The eunuchs weren't just victims. They were the most powerful non-royal people in the empire. They controlled armies, managed imperial finances, and had the emperor's ear on everything from military strategy to religious policy. Yet their very existence depended on a single biological fact that made them vulnerable to unimaginable cruelty. I'm about to walk you through 7 documented cases of imperial brutality that reveal how the Byzantine Empire turned human suffering into both art and politics. These aren't legends or exaggerations. These are recorded historical events with eyewitness accounts, official court documents, and archaeological evidence. By the time we're done, you'll understand why eunuchs simultaneously held ultimate power and faced ultimate vulnerability in one of history's most sophisticated civilizations. The relationship between Byzantine emperors and their eunuchs was unlike anything else in the medieval world. While Western Europe was still figuring out basic agriculture, Constantinople had developed a complex system where castrated men became the backbone of imperial administration. They couldn't threaten the dynasty through their own children, couldn't form military alliances through marriage, and theoretically had no divided loyalties. Perfect servants, right? Wrong. Dead wrong. Because when you give someone that much power while simultaneously marking them as fundamentally different, as less than fully human, you create a powder keg of resentment and paranoia. The emperors needed their eunuchs, but also feared them. The eunuchs served their emperors, but also manipulated them. And when that delicate balance collapsed, the results were absolutely horrific. Let me set the scene for you. The Great Palace of Constantinople wasn't just a residence. It was a city within a city, housing over 20,000 people, including thousands of eunuchs who managed everything from the emperor's wardrobe to the empire's foreign policy. These weren't the simplified eunuchs you might imagine from popular culture. They were brilliant administrators, cunning politicians, and sophisticated scholars who spoke multiple languages and understood international diplomacy better than most kings. But they were also trapped. Once castrated, usually as children, they could never leave imperial service. They lived their entire lives in gilded cages, knowing that their safety depended entirely on imperial favor. And imperial favor, as you're about to discover, was about as reliable as a candle in a hurricane. The first thing you need to understand about Byzantine imperial cruelty is that it wasn't random. Every act of torture, every creative punishment, every elaborate execution served a political purpose. The emperors weren't sadists, though some certainly enjoyed their work. They were sending messages to other eunuchs, to foreign ambassadors, to their own people. The message was always the same. Absolute power means absolute consequences for disobedience. Take Emperor Basil I, who ruled from 867 to 886. His reign was marked by military victories and administrative reforms that historians still praise today. But Basil had a problem. His chief eunuch, a man named Christopher the Logothete, had been embezzling imperial funds to build a private army of loyal supporters. Not planning rebellion, mind you, just creating a personal power base that made Basil nervous. The punishment Basil devised wasn't just cruel, it was surgical in its precision. Christopher was stripped of his titles and properties, standard enough. But then came the creative part. Basil ordered that Christopher be sewn into a fresh oxhide and left in the sun. As the hide dried and contracted, it slowly crushed every bone in the eunuch's body over the course of 3 days. But here's the truly diabolical detail. The hide was positioned so that Christopher's head remained free, allowing him to watch his own body being slowly compressed while remaining conscious throughout the entire process. Why this particular method? Because Basil wanted other eunuchs to see what happened to those who tried to build independent power bases. The message wasn't just about punishment. It was about the complete futility of resistance. Christopher had been one of the most powerful men in the empire, controlling vast resources and commanding respect from senators and generals. Yet in the end, he died helplessly while his own body betrayed him, crushed by forces he couldn't control or escape. But Basil's creativity was just getting started. The aftermath of Christopher's execution revealed the true sophistication of Byzantine psychological warfare. The emperor ordered that Christopher's compressed remains be displayed in the palace courtyard for exactly 40 days, the traditional mourning period. But every morning, palace servants were required to bring fresh flowers and burn incense around the corpse, as if honoring a fallen hero rather than displaying a traitor's punishment. The psychological effect on the other eunuchs was devastating. They were forced to participate in a ceremony that simultaneously honored and desecrated their former colleague. The flowers and incense suggested respect, but the crushed, rotting corpse told the real story. Every day for 40 days, they had to confront the reality that their own power was an illusion, that their bodies could be transformed into objects of horror at imperial whim. And that's where Byzantine cruelty truly excelled. It wasn't enough to punish the guilty. The punishment had to educate the innocent, to remind everyone else of their place in the imperial hierarchy. Christopher's death became a daily lesson in the limits of eunuch power, taught through the most visceral possible means. But individual acts of cruelty, however creative, weren't the real horror. The real horror was the systematic nature of imperial brutality. The Byzantine court developed an entire culture around the punishment of eunuchs, complete with traditions, protocols, and specialized equipment. They turned human suffering into a refined art form. Emperor Constantine VII, who ruled from 945 to 959, inherited a court where eunuch punishment had become so sophisticated that there were official positions dedicated to its administration. The master of the sacred bedchamber wasn't just responsible for the emperor's personal quarters. He also oversaw what the court euphemistically called corrective procedures for disobedient eunuchs. These procedures weren't improvised acts of rage. They were carefully planned events that could take weeks to organize properly. The court maintained detailed records of which punishments had been used on which eunuchs, ensuring that no method was repeated too frequently. Variety, you see, was essential to maintaining the psychological impact. Constantine's contribution to this tradition was the development of what modern historians call graduated punishment. Instead of jumping straight to execution, disobedient eunuchs faced an escalating series of torments designed to break their spirit while keeping them alive and functional. The goal wasn't death. Death was easy. The goal was the complete destruction of individual will while preserving administrative competence. The process began with social humiliation. A eunuch accused of disobedience would be stripped of his titles and forced to perform menial tasks normally reserved for slaves. Not just any menial tasks, but specifically degrading ones designed to emphasize their altered status. They might be required to clean the palace latrines, serve food to visitors while naked, or perform dances that mock their own castration. But humiliation was just the appetizer. Phase 2 involved what the court called educational modifications. These were surgical procedures designed to alter the eunuch's appearance in ways that marked them as punished without necessarily impairing their ability to work. Ears might be cropped, noses slit, or tongues partially removed. The specific modification depended on the nature of their offense and the emperor's mood. The true genius of graduated punishment was that it created a visible hierarchy of suffering within the eunuch community. You could look at any palace servant and immediately understand their history of obedience or defiance. Those with intact faces had never seriously challenged imperial authority. Those with missing ears had committed minor offenses. Those with more extensive modifications had pushed their luck further. This system turned the eunuchs into walking advertisements for imperial power. Every disfigured face was a reminder of what happened to those who forgot their place. But it also created a perverse incentive structure where eunuchs competed to demonstrate their loyalty, knowing that any perceived slight could result in permanent physical alteration. The third phase of graduated punishment was reserved for eunuchs who either committed truly serious offenses or failed to learn from their earlier corrections. This is where Byzantine creativity truly flourished, where individual emperors competed to devise new methods of extending suffering while preserving life. Emperor John Tzimiskes, who ruled from 969 to 976, pioneered what he called living sculpture. Disobedient eunuchs weren't just tortured, they were transformed into artistic statements that decorated the palace grounds. The process involved careful surgical modification combined with specialized feeding and medical care, designed to keep the victims alive indefinitely in their altered states. One documented case involves a eunuch named Nikephoros, the curator, who had been caught selling imperial artworks to finance his gambling debts. Tzimiskes ordered that Nikephoros be surgically modified to resemble a classical statue, with limbs repositioned and held in place by internal metal frameworks. The eunuch was then installed in the palace garden, where he was fed through tubes and kept alive as a living artwork for over 3 years. Visitors to the palace would admire the lifelike quality of the garden sculpture, not knowing they were looking at a still living human being who had been transformed into a permanent monument to imperial justice. The psychological effect on other eunuchs was profound. They were forced to walk past their former colleague daily, watching him endure a fate that was arguably worse than death. But even this wasn't the peak of Byzantine ingenuity. That honor belongs to what came next, when individual cruelty evolved into systematic terror that affected entire generations of palace servants. The emperors had learned that isolated punishments, however creative, had limited impact. What they needed was a system that would make every eunuch complicit in the enforcement of imperial will. This is where our story takes its darkest turn, because what the Byzantine court developed next wasn't just cruelty. It was a machine for manufacturing trauma that operated continuously for over 2 centuries. A system so sophisticated that it didn't just punish individual disobedience. It rewrote the fundamental psychology of an entire class of people, turning victims into enthusiastic participants in their own oppression. And that system started with something as simple as a monthly ceremony that every eunuch in the palace was required to attend. Something the court called the renewal of bonds, which sounds almost pleasant until you understand what actually happened in those marble halls where power and suffering danced together in perfect, horrifying harmony. The renewal of bonds ceremony took place on the first day of each month in the Hall of the 19 Couches, a magnificent chamber decorated with mosaics depicting the triumphs of previous emperors. Every eunuch in imperial service, from the most powerful logothetes to the youngest palace pages, was required to attend. They would arrange themselves in precise hierarchical order, their positions determined not just by rank, but by their history of punishment and reward. What made this ceremony truly diabolical wasn't what happened to the participants, it was what they were forced to witness. Each month, the master of the sacred bedchamber would select one eunuch for what the court euphemistically called renewal. This wasn't random selection. The chosen eunuch was always someone who had committed a minor infraction, something that might normally warrant a reprimand or temporary loss of privileges. But minor infractions became pretext for major demonstrations. The selected eunuch would be brought forward while the entire assembly watched in mandatory silence. What followed wasn't execution or even traditional torture. It was something far more psychologically devastating. The victim would be subjected to what the court called identity dissolution, a process that systematically stripped away every aspect of their personal history and individual identity. The process began with the reading of charges, but not just the recent infraction that had triggered their selection. Court scribes would recite every detail of the eunuch's life from the moment of their castration. Their original name, their place of birth, their family background, their education, their career achievements, their personal relationships within the palace. Everything that made them an individual person was laid out for the assembly to hear. Then came the erasure. The emperor himself would declare that this person had never existed. Their name was struck from all records. Their personal possessions were redistributed. Their quarters were reassigned. Any eunuch caught mentioning their name or acknowledging their former existence faced immediate punishment. But here's the truly horrifying part. The victim wasn't killed. They remained in the palace, but as a non-person, referred to only by a number and assigned the most degrading tasks. The psychological impact on the watching eunuchs was devastating. They were forced to witness the complete obliteration of someone they had known and worked with for years. Someone who had been a colleague, a friend, perhaps even a mentor or protege. And they had to pretend it never happened. They had to walk past this person daily and act as if they were looking at a piece of furniture rather than a human being they once knew. But Emperor Romanos IV, who ruled from 1068 to 1071, took this system even further. He understood that forced amnesia, however effective, still left room for private sympathy and hidden resistance. What he needed was a way to make the eunuchs actively participate in the destruction of their colleagues. He needed to transform them from unwilling witnesses into enthusiastic collaborators. Romanos introduced what he called the loyalty verification process. During each monthly ceremony, after the identity dissolution had been completed, every attending eunuch was required to demonstrate their commitment to imperial will through active participation in their colleagues' degradation. They weren't just watching anymore. They were performing. The process was elegantly simple and utterly devastating. Each eunuch in order of seniority was required to approach the newly erased person and perform a specific act of denial. They might spit on them, strike them, or recite a prepared statement declaring that this creature had never been their friend or colleague. The specific action didn't matter. What mattered was the psychological transformation that occurred when victims became perpetrators. The court scribes documented the effects with clinical precision. Eunuchs who had been forced to participate in these loyalty demonstrations showed measurable changes in behavior within weeks. They became more aggressive toward their subordinates, more paranoid about their colleagues, and more desperate to prove their devotion to the emperor. The ceremony had achieved something that individual punishment could never accomplish. It had turned the entire eunuch community into an enforcement mechanism for imperial will. But Romanos wasn't satisfied with monthly demonstrations. He wanted a system that operated continuously, that made every interaction between eunuchs a potential loyalty test. So he introduced the vigilance protocols, a system that required every eunuch to report on the activities and conversations of their colleagues. Not just obvious acts of disloyalty, but any behavior that might indicate insufficient enthusiasm for imperial service. The protocols were deliberately vague and subjective. A eunuch who seemed tired during morning prayers might be reported for spiritual laxity. One who ate too little at formal dinners might be suspected of fasting in protest. One who ate too much might be accused of gluttony and disrespect. The system was designed to ensure that everyone was simultaneously a potential victim and a potential informant. Within months, the palace eunuch community had transformed into something resembling a perpetual witch hunt. Longtime friends turned on each other to demonstrate loyalty. Mentors reported their protégés to avoid suspicion. The very bonds of human connection that might have provided comfort in their oppressive situation became sources of danger and betrayal. And this is where the true genius of Byzantine psychological warfare becomes apparent. The emperors had discovered that the most effective way to control a population wasn't through external force alone. It was through creating conditions that made the population control itself. The eunuchs weren't just afraid of imperial punishment anymore, they were afraid of each other. Emperor Alexios I, who ruled from 1081 to 1118, inherited this system and refined it into something approaching scientific precision. He established what he called the Institute for Administrative Excellence, which sounds like a modern business school, but was actually a laboratory for studying and perfecting methods of psychological control. The institute maintained detailed records of every eunuch in imperial service. Not just their official duties and performance metrics, but psychological profiles that tracked their emotional responses to various stimuli. Which punishments were most effective for different personality types? How long did loyalty demonstrations need to continue before they became internalized rather than merely performed? What combination of rewards and threats produced the most reliable obedience? The Institute's researchers discovered that the most effective control mechanism wasn't fear of punishment. It was hope for reward. Eunuchs who believed they might someday achieve higher status or imperial favor were far more compliant than those who had given up hope entirely. So Alexios created an elaborate system of advancement opportunities that were theoretically available to any eunuch but practically impossible to achieve. The system worked like a lottery where the prizes were real, but the odds were astronomical. Every year, a few carefully selected eunuchs would be promoted to prestigious positions or granted special privileges. These success stories were widely publicized throughout the palace, creating the impression that advancement was possible for those who demonstrated sufficient loyalty and competence. But the selection process was deliberately opaque and seemingly arbitrary. Eunuchs who performed their duties flawlessly for decades might never receive recognition, while others who seemed no more qualified would suddenly be elevated to positions of influence. The message was clear. Imperial favor was a gift that couldn't be earned through merit alone, only through complete submission to imperial will. This system created what modern psychologists would recognize as a form of intermittent reinforcement, one of the most powerful tools for shaping behavior. The eunuchs never knew when their loyalty might be rewarded, so they maintained constant vigilance and maximum effort. They competed desperately against each other for imperial attention, never realizing that the competition itself was the point. The Institute's records showed that this system was extraordinarily effective at maintaining control, while minimizing the need for dramatic punishments. The monthly renewal of bond ceremonies continued, but they became less frequent as the eunuchs internalized the behavioral expectations. The threat of punishment remained, but it operated in the background, while hope for advancement provided the primary motivation. But Alexios's greatest innovation was recognizing that even the most sophisticated control system would eventually face resistance if it remained static. Human beings adapt to their circumstances, and what seems unbearable at first can become routine over time. To maintain effectiveness, the system needed to evolve continuously, introducing new elements of uncertainty and control. So Alexios established the rotation protocols, a system that periodically shuffled the entire palace hierarchy without warning or explanation. Eunuchs who had spent years building relationships and understanding their roles would suddenly find themselves in completely different positions with different responsibilities and different colleagues. The effect was to prevent the formation of stable social networks that might provide emotional support or enable coordinated resistance. The psychological impact was devastating. Just as eunuchs began to feel comfortable in their circumstances, those circumstances would change entirely. They could never build the kind of deep relationships that might sustain them through difficult periods because they never knew when those relationships would be severed by administrative decree. And this constant disruption served another purpose. It made the eunuchs completely dependent on the imperial system for any sense of identity or purpose. Without stable roles or relationships, their entire sense of self became tied to their position within the palace hierarchy. They couldn't imagine existence outside the system because the system had become their entire world. This is the point where Byzantine control of their eunuchs transcended simple cruelty and entered the realm of what we might now call psychological engineering. They had created a human machine that operated according to precise principles, where individual components could be replaced or modified without affecting overall function. The eunuchs weren't just servants anymore, they were living extensions of imperial will, programmed to enforce the emperor's desires even when he wasn't present to give direct orders. But, like all machines, this system had weaknesses. And when those weaknesses were finally exposed, the resulting catastrophe would make all the previous cruelties seem almost merciful by comparison. Because the emperors had created something so efficient at suppressing human nature that when it finally broke down, the accumulated pressure of centuries of repressed humanity exploded with devastating force. That explosion began with something as simple as a young eunuch asking a question he wasn't supposed to ask. A question about what had happened to his predecessor. a question that revealed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the entire system. And once that question was asked, the carefully constructed machinery of control began to collapse in ways that no one, not even the emperors themselves, could have predicted or prevented. The question came from a 16-year-old eunuch named Michael Palaeologus, recently arrived from a monastery in Anatolia, where he'd been castrated as a child and educated in classical literature and imperial protocol. Unlike the palace-born eunuchs who knew nothing beyond the marble corridors and whispered hierarchies, Michael remembered the outside world. He remembered his mother's voice, the smell of bread baking, the feeling of grass beneath his feet. And that memory made him dangerous. It was during a routine morning assembly in the Hall of Sacred Service when Michael raised his hand and asked the master of the sacred bedchamber a simple question. What happened to Stephanos, the curator? Yesterday he was here, today his quarters are empty, but I don't remember any ceremony. The silence that followed was deafening. 300 eunuchs stood frozen, their eyes fixed on the marble floor, their breathing barely perceptible. The master of the sacred bedchamber, a man named Constantine Lascaris, whose own face bore the ritual scars of 20 years of survival in the palace hierarchy, stared at the young eunuch with something approaching terror, because Michael had just violated the fundamental rule that kept the entire system functioning. He had acknowledged that someone who had been officially erased had once existed. He had spoken the name of a non-person, and worse, he had done it in front of witnesses who were now complicit in his crime simply by hearing it. The master's response was swift and decisive. Within minutes, palace guards had surrounded Michael and escorted him from the hall. The remaining eunuchs were ordered to continue their duties as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, and everyone knew it. The question had been asked, the name had been spoken, and the careful amnesia that held the system together had been cracked. What followed wasn't the immediate punishment you might expect. Emperor John II Komnenos, who ruled from 1118 to 1143, understood that hasty reactions could destabilize the entire control system. Instead, he ordered what the court called a comprehensive evaluation of palace security protocols. In practice, this meant every eunuch in imperial service was subjected to intensive interrogation, designed to determine the extent of unofficial memory and unauthorized sympathy. The interrogations weren't conducted by imperial officials or professional torturers. They were conducted by the eunuchs themselves. Each servant was assigned to question 3 of their colleagues about their recollections of recently erased individuals. They were required to report any signs of forbidden memory, unauthorized emotion, or dangerous curiosity. The system that had taught them to spy on each other was now weaponized to hunt down traces of human compassion. The psychological pressure was immense. Eunuchs who had spent years building careful relationships of mutual protection suddenly found themselves forced to choose between betraying their friends and risking their own erasure. The interviews weren't conducted in private. They took place in public spaces where other eunuchs could observe and judge the enthusiasm with which their colleagues pursued forbidden memories. Within weeks, the palace eunuch community had torn itself apart. Longtime allies accused each other of sentimental attachment to erased persons. Mentors reported protégés for asking too many questions. Even the most cautious servants found themselves under suspicion for crimes as minor as avoiding eye contact during the loyalty demonstrations, or failing to show sufficient enthusiasm while denying the existence of former colleagues. But the real horror wasn't the accusations or the betrayals. It was what the eunuchs discovered about themselves during the process. Men who had considered themselves decent, moral individuals found they were capable of destroying others to protect their own positions. They discovered that survival could transform anyone into an enthusiastic participant in systematic cruelty. The documentation from this period reads like a psychological case study in the breakdown of human decency under extreme pressure. Court scribes recorded confessions from eunuchs who admitted to reporting friends for imaginary infractions. They documented servants who volunteered information about colleagues' private conversations, desperate to demonstrate their loyalty by offering evidence of others' disloyalty. Emperor John watched this self-destruction with clinical fascination. He had discovered something profound about human nature. that the most effective torture wasn't physical pain inflicted by enemies, but psychological pressure that forced people to destroy themselves and each other. The eunuchs weren't just being punished for Michael's question. They were being transformed into instruments of their own oppression. The interrogation process revealed another crucial weakness in the system. The eunuchs had been developing their own informal networks of mutual support, unofficial relationships that provided emotional sustenance in their oppressive environment. These bonds had grown stronger over time, creating alternative loyalties that competed with imperial authority. Michael's question had exposed these hidden connections, and now they had to be systematically destroyed. John's solution was elegant and devastating. He introduced what he called the purification protocols, a system that didn't just punish individual violations, but eliminated the possibility of forming meaningful human relationships within the palace structure. The protocols required constant rotation of duties, random reassignment of quarters, and mandatory participation in activities designed to prevent the formation of lasting bonds. The effect was to create a community of isolated individuals who lived in constant proximity but could never develop the trust and intimacy that might sustain resistance to imperial will. The eunuchs were surrounded by people but utterly alone, watching each other constantly but unable to rely on each other for emotional support. But John's masterstroke was recognizing that Michael himself represented a unique opportunity. The young eunuch's question hadn't just revealed flaws in the system. It had demonstrated that eunuchs with outside memories posed a fundamental threat to palace control. They retained concepts of human dignity and individual worth that made them resistant to complete psychological domination, so John ordered a complete review of recruitment protocols. No longer would the palace accept eunuchs who had any meaningful memory of life outside imperial service. The new standard required castration before age 8, followed by immediate placement in specialized training facilities where children would be raised from infancy with no knowledge of alternative ways of living. The implications were staggering. The palace wasn't just controlling adult servants anymore. It was manufacturing human beings specifically designed for absolute obedience. These new recruits would have no baseline for comparison, no memories of freedom or dignity, no conception that their circumstances were abnormal or unjust. The training facilities themselves were marvels of psychological engineering. Children were raised in environments that replicated palace conditions exactly, but with additional controls that prevented the development of individual identity. They were never given personal names, only functional designations. They were never allowed privacy or personal possessions. They were trained from birth to find fulfillment only through service to imperial authority. But the most insidious aspect of the new system was how it handled human emotions and relationships. The children weren't isolated from each other. Instead, they were taught to form bonds that served imperial purposes. They learned to love their supervisors, to compete desperately for approval, to find meaning through their position in carefully constructed hierarchies. By the time these manufactured servants entered palace service, they were psychologically incapable of questioning imperial authority. They had been designed from birth to find rebellion literally unthinkable. The concept of resistance simply didn't exist in their mental framework because they had never been exposed to alternative possibilities. The first generation of these custom-made eunuchs entered service around 1140, and their impact on palace culture was immediately apparent. Unlike the previous servants who had maintained at least some capacity for independent thought, these new recruits displayed a form of loyalty that bordered on religious devotion. They didn't just obey orders, they anticipated them, competed to exceed them, and found genuine happiness in their complete submission to imperial will. The older eunuchs, those who retained some memory of independent existence, watched this transformation with horror. They were witnessing the birth of a new form of human being, one that had been systematically stripped of everything that made resistance possible. These weren't just servants. They were living proof that human nature itself could be rewritten through sufficiently sophisticated manipulation. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't what these manufactured servants could do. It was what they couldn't do. They were incapable of forming the kind of relationships that might provide mutual support during difficult periods. They couldn't conceive of existence outside imperial service. They had no capacity for moral reasoning that might lead them to question their circumstances. Emperor John had achieved something unprecedented in human history. He had created a class of human beings who were psychologically incapable of rebellion, not because they were afraid of punishment, but because the concept of rebellion simply didn't exist in their mental framework. They were perfect servants because they had been designed to be incapable of being anything else. The success of this system was so complete that subsequent emperors expanded it continuously. By 1180, virtually every eunuch in imperial service had been manufactured rather than recruited from the outside world. The palace had become a closed system populated entirely by individuals who had been designed for absolute obedience. But perfection, as the Byzantines would soon discover, came with its own dangers. Because when you create human beings who are incapable of independent thought, you also create human beings who are incapable of adapting to unexpected circumstances. And when those circumstances arrived, the empire's most sophisticated servants would prove to be its greatest vulnerability. The crisis began in 1185 when Emperor Isaac II Angelus faced a military emergency that required rapid adaptation of palace protocols. Enemy forces were approaching Constantinople, and the imperial administration needed to coordinate defensive preparations with unprecedented speed and flexibility. But the manufactured eunuchs, despite their absolute loyalty, proved incapable of functioning outside their carefully programmed parameters. They could execute established procedures with perfect efficiency, but they couldn't modify those procedures when circumstances changed. They could follow orders with absolute precision, but they couldn't interpret the spirit of orders when the literal instructions became obsolete. They had been designed for obedience, not intelligence, and the empire was about to pay the price for that distinction. The palace that had spent centuries perfecting human control was about to discover that the most perfectly controlled humans were also the most perfectly useless when perfection was no longer sufficient. And Isaac, watching his empire crumble while his most loyal servants stood paralyzed by their own manufactured limitations, would learn the final lesson about the relationship between power and cruelty, that the ultimate act of imperial brutality wasn't what you did to your enemies, but what you did to yourself. The manufactured eunuchs stood in perfect formation as Constantinople burned on the horizon, their faces displaying the serene confusion of machines asked to perform beyond their programming. Isaac watched in growing horror as his most trusted advisors, the products of decades of psychological engineering, proved utterly incapable of independent decision-making when their established protocols no longer applied. When the enemy's siege engines appeared at the city walls, the palace eunuchs consulted their procedural manuals with religious devotion. The manuals specified exact responses to 17 different types of military threats, but none covered the current situation. So the eunuchs did nothing. They stood in their assigned positions waiting for orders that fit their predetermined categories, while the empire's defenses crumbled around them. The irony was suffocating. The Byzantine court had spent generations creating the perfect servants, human beings so thoroughly controlled that rebellion was psychologically impossible. But in eliminating their capacity for resistance, they had also eliminated their capacity for creativity, adaptability, and independent problem-solving. The same mental modifications that made them ideal peacetime administrators made them catastrophically useless during actual crises. Emperor Isaac's personal secretary, a manufactured eunuch named Constantine the Chronicler, exemplified the problem perfectly. For 30 years, he had managed imperial correspondence with flawless efficiency, processing thousands of documents according to established categories and priority systems. But when Isaac desperately needed someone to draft innovative diplomatic proposals to potential allies, Constantine could only produce form letters that followed traditional templates. The situation requires new approaches, Isaac explained frantically. We need to offer unprecedented concessions, break with diplomatic tradition, think beyond established protocols. Constantine stared at him with the blank expression of a computer receiving incompatible software. Your Imperial Majesty, the diplomatic manual contains 47 approved message formats. Which category does this correspondence belong to? It doesn't belong to any category, Isaac screamed. That's the point. We need something completely new. But Constantine had been manufactured to find meaning only through adherence to established procedures. The concept of innovation wasn't just foreign to him. It was literally impossible for his reconstructed psychology to process. He stood motionless, trapped between his desire to serve and his complete inability to understand what service required. The military situation deteriorated rapidly as enemy forces exploited weaknesses that the manufactured eunuchs couldn't recognize because those weaknesses didn't appear in their training manuals. The palace's intelligence network, staffed entirely by perfectly obedient servants, continued to collect information according to established patterns while missing crucial developments that fell outside their programmed categories. The financial administration collapsed when enemy actions disrupted trade routes in ways that the manufactured treasurers had never been taught to address. They could calculate taxes and manage expenditures with mathematical precision, but they couldn't adapt their systems when traditional revenue sources disappeared overnight. Even the palace's domestic operations began failing as manufactured servants struggled to maintain routines when basic supplies became unavailable. They had been trained to perform specific tasks using specific materials following specific procedures. When those materials disappeared or those procedures became impossible, they simply stopped functioning. Isaac found himself ruling an empire staffed entirely by human machines that had broken down simultaneously, not through malice or rebellion, but through their own manufactured limitations. The perfect servants had become perfect obstacles to imperial survival. The emperor's attempts to retrain his manufactured eunuchs revealed the true horror of what the Byzantine system had accomplished. These weren't just psychologically damaged individuals who might recover with time and therapy. They were fundamentally different types of human beings whose mental architecture had been permanently altered during their formative years. When Isaac tried to teach Constantine basic principles of creative problem-solving, the eunuch's responses followed a predictable pattern. He would listen attentively, nod at appropriate intervals, and then ask which manual contained the procedures for implementing creativity. The concept that problems might require solutions that didn't already exist in written form was literally beyond his comprehension. The manufactured eunuchs weren't stupid. Their intellectual capabilities were actually quite impressive within their designed parameters. They could memorize vast amounts of information, perform complex calculations, and execute intricate procedures with perfect precision. But their intelligence was entirely reactive, responsive only to situations they had been specifically programmed to handle. The psychological evaluations that Isaac ordered revealed the extent of the damage. The manufactured eunuchs showed no capacity for abstract thinking, no ability to extrapolate from known situations to unknown ones, no facility for recognizing patterns that crossed categorical boundaries. They were brilliant specialists who had been rendered incapable of general intelligence. But the most disturbing discovery was that they were perfectly content with their limitations. The manufactured eunuchs didn't experience frustration when confronted with problems beyond their capabilities. They didn't feel curiosity about alternative solutions or resentment about their restricted mental horizons. They had been designed to find fulfillment only through successful execution of predetermined tasks, and they genuinely couldn't conceive of any other form of satisfaction. Emperor Isaac realized he was facing a crisis that transcended military defeat or political upheaval. The Byzantine Empire had systematically eliminated human nature from its most essential servants, replacing it with something that looked like humanity but lacked its fundamental characteristics. They had created a class of beings who were psychologically incapable of growth, adaptation, or independent thought. The immediate military crisis forced Isaac to make desperate decisions. He began recruiting advisors from outside the palace system, bringing in provincial administrators and military officers who retained the capacity for independent thinking. These newcomers were shocked by what they found in Constantinople's corridors of power. A general named Michael Kanakousenos, summoned from the Anatolian frontier, described his first meeting with the palace administration in terms that read like horror fiction. They move like dancers following choreography, but the music stopped playing years ago. They perform their roles with perfect precision, but they cannot hear that the performance no longer serves any purpose. The contrast between the manufactured eunuchs and normal human beings became starkly apparent during emergency planning sessions. The outside advisors would propose strategies, debate alternatives, and modify their approaches based on changing circumstances. Meanwhile, the palace eunuchs sat silent and motionless, waiting for someone to tell them which of their predetermined responses was appropriate. When Isaac tried to integrate the two groups, the results were catastrophic. The manufactured eunuchs couldn't function in environments that required flexibility and creativity. Their psychological architecture was fundamentally incompatible with the kind of adaptive thinking that military crises demanded. They became obstacles rather than assets, their perfect obedience transformed into perfect uselessness. The emperor found himself in the surreal position of having to protect his most loyal servants from the very situations they had been created to handle. The manufactured eunuchs were psychologically incapable of recognizing their own limitations, so they continued attempting to execute their programmed functions, even when those functions had become counterproductive or impossible. Constantine the Chronicler, for example, continued producing daily administrative reports according to his established format, even as enemy forces occupied half the city. His reports were masterpieces of bureaucratic precision, documenting the systematic collapse of imperial authority with the same clinical detachment he had once applied to routine correspondence. Today's revenue collections totaled 0 solidi, one report noted with mathematical accuracy. This represents a decline of 100% from yesterday's total of 0 solidi. Recommend consulting Manual Section 47B for procedures addressing revenue shortfalls exceeding 95%. But Manual Section 47B addressed temporary disruptions in normal revenue streams, not the complete collapse of imperial authority. Constantine couldn't recognize the difference because he had been manufactured to process information through predetermined categories, not to understand the reality those categories were supposed to represent. The manufactured eunuch's inability to adapt became increasingly dangerous as the military situation deteriorated. They continued following security protocols designed for peacetime palace operations, even as enemy agents infiltrated the imperial administration. They maintained elaborate ceremonial procedures while the empire's defenses crumbled. They processed paperwork with religious devotion while Constantinople prepared for siege. Isaac's growing desperation led him to attempt something that previous emperors had never considered necessary. He tried to reverse the psychological modifications that had created his perfect servants, to restore some capacity for independent thought and adaptive behavior. But the court physicians who examined the manufactured eunuchs delivered devastating news. The psychological alterations weren't temporary conditioning that could be reversed through therapy or re-education. They were permanent modifications to basic neural architecture, implemented during critical developmental periods when the brain's fundamental structures were still forming. The manufactured eunuchs weren't psychologically damaged. They were psychologically different, as distinct from normal humans as humans were from other species. Dr. Nikephoros, the physician, one of the few remaining court medical officers who predated the manufacturing system, explained the situation with clinical precision. Your Imperial Majesty, what we created wasn't damaged humans who might be repaired. We created a new type of human being with fundamentally different mental architecture. They cannot be changed any more than a horse can be taught to fly. The implications were staggering. The Byzantine Empire had systematically replaced its administrative class with beings who looked human but lacked humanity's essential characteristics. They had created a government staffed entirely by organic machines that could perform predetermined functions but couldn't adapt when those functions became obsolete. As enemy forces tightened their siege of Constantinople, Isaac faced the ultimate consequence of centuries of imperial cruelty. The empire that had perfected human control had discovered that perfectly controlled humans were perfectly useless when control was no longer sufficient. The manufactured eunuchs, who had once seemed like the ultimate achievement of Byzantine administrative science, had become the empire's greatest vulnerability. The emperor's final realization came during a desperate war council, as enemy catapults began targeting the palace itself. Isaac looked around the room at his manufactured advisors, their faces displaying the serene confusion of beings asked to function beyond their design parameters, and understood the true horror of what the Byzantine system had accomplished. They had committed the ultimate act of imperial brutality, not against their enemies or even against their servants, but against the very concept of human nature itself. They had proven that human beings could be systematically stripped of everything that made them human, while remaining technically alive and functional. They had created the perfect servants by destroying the very qualities that made service meaningful. The manufactured eunuchs weren't victims in any traditional sense. They couldn't suffer from their limitations because they had been designed to find fulfillment only through successful execution of predetermined tasks. They couldn't mourn their lost humanity because they had never experienced humanity in the first place. They were content with their restrictions because contentment was all they had ever known. But their contentment was perhaps the most horrifying aspect of the entire system. They represented proof that human consciousness itself could be rewritten, that the qualities people considered essentially human were actually contingent and modifiable. The manufactured eunuchs were living demonstrations that there was nothing sacred or inviolable about human nature, that it could be edited and revised according to political necessity. Emperor Isaac, watching his empire collapse while his most loyal servants stood paralyzed by their own manufactured perfection, finally understood the true cost of Byzantine cruelty. They hadn't just tortured and killed thousands of individual eunuchs over the centuries. They had committed genocide against human nature itself, systematically eliminating the psychological characteristics that made resistance, creativity, and adaptation possible. The manufactured eunuchs who filled the palace corridors weren't the descendants of the original eunuch community. They were replacements, artificial beings designed to look like humans while lacking humanity's essential characteristics. The Byzantine Empire had achieved the ultimate victory over human rebellion by eliminating humans and replacing them with something else entirely. As Constantinople's walls crumbled and enemy soldiers poured through the breach, Isaac realized that the empire's greatest achievement had also been its final mistake. They had solved the problem of human resistance so completely that they had eliminated humans themselves, leaving behind only the hollow shells of beings who looked human, but had been systematically stripped of everything that made humanity worth preserving. The manufactured eunuchs maintained their perfect composure even as the palace burned around them, waiting patiently for orders that would never come, following procedures that no longer served any purpose, demonstrating absolute loyalty to an empire that had destroyed itself through the very perfection of its control. They were the ultimate products of Byzantine administrative science and the ultimate proof of its fundamental horror. And in their serene, manufactured faces, Isaac could see the reflection of what the empire had become, a system so perfectly designed for control that it had forgotten why control was necessary in the first place. The Byzantine Empire hadn't just fallen to external enemies. It had committed suicide through the systematic elimination of the human spirit that had once made it great. The final irony revealed itself in the palace's last hours as Constantinople fell to the Fourth Crusade in 1204. The manufactured eunuchs, those perfect products of centuries of psychological engineering, faced their ultimate test. And they failed in the most perfectly predictable way possible. As Crusader knights smashed through the palace gates, the manufactured eunuchs consulted their emergency protocols with religious devotion, but their manuals contained no procedures for defending against Christian armies, only against Muslim invaders. The distinction mattered to their programmed minds. They could execute anti-Muslim defense strategies with flawless precision, but Christian attackers fell outside their operational categories. So they did nothing. They stood in formation while armored knights ransacked the treasury. They maintained ceremonial postures while centuries of accumulated wealth disappeared into crusader wagons. They processed evacuation paperwork while the empire collapsed around them, because processing paperwork was what they had been designed to do. The Crusader chronicler Geoffroy de Villardouin recorded his amazement at these strange servants who continued performing administrative duties while their world ended. He wrote of finding eunuchs in the imperial archives carefully filing documents about the siege's progress, updating inventories of stolen treasures, and maintaining correspondence logs even as the palace burned. One manufactured eunuch, designated Administrative Unit 7, approached Crusader knights with a stack of requisition forms. He politely requested that they complete the proper documentation, before removing imperial property. When the knights ignored him, he continued following them through the corridors, repeatedly offering the forms with increasing confusion as his programmed understanding of reality collided with actual circumstances. The Crusaders found these encounters deeply unsettling. They had expected to face desperate resistance or terrified submission. Instead, they discovered human-shaped beings who seemed incapable of processing what was happening to them. The manufactured eunuchs weren't afraid of death or conquest because fear required the capacity for independent assessment of danger, and that capacity had been systematically eliminated from their psychological architecture. Some Crusader accounts describe attempting to interrogate captured eunuchs about imperial treasures and defensive capabilities, but the manufactured servants could only provide information that appeared in their authorized databases. When asked about hidden wealth or secret passages, they would consult their mental catalogs and report that no such items appeared in their assigned categories. The interrogators grew frustrated as they realized these weren't normal prisoners who might be broken through torture or intimidation. The manufactured eunuchs felt no loyalty to secrets because they had no concept of secrecy itself. They were perfectly willing to share any information they possessed, but they only possessed information they had been programmed to retain. More disturbing were the eunuchs who continued attempting to serve their new masters according to their original programming. They approached Crusader commanders offering administrative assistance, proposing to manage the conquered territories using established Byzantine procedures. They couldn't understand why foreign conquerors might want different administrative systems because they had been designed to find meaning only through the execution of predetermined functions. The Crusaders faced an unprecedented problem. They had conquered an empire staffed by beings who looked human but functioned like elaborate machines. These manufactured servants were perfectly willing to serve new masters, but they could only serve according to their original programming. They were psychologically incapable of adapting their service to meet different cultural expectations or administrative requirements. Some Crusader leaders attempted to retrain the manufactured eunuchs for new roles, but these efforts failed catastrophically. The eunuchs could memorize new procedures if they closely resembled existing ones, but they couldn't understand why different procedures might be necessary or desirable. They executed Western administrative methods with the same mechanical precision they had once applied to Byzantine systems, but they couldn't grasp the cultural context that gave those methods meaning. The manufactured eunuchs became living museums of a dead empire, preserving Byzantine administrative procedures with perfect fidelity long after the empire itself had ceased to exist. They continued performing imperial ceremonies in empty halls, maintained correspondence with officials who no longer existed, and processed documents for an administration that had been completely dismantled. Their inability to process the reality of imperial collapse created surreal situations throughout the occupied territories. Manufactured eunuchs would appear at Crusader administrative centers, requesting resources for Byzantine military units that had been disbanded months earlier. They submitted budget proposals for imperial projects that would never be completed. They filed reports about the progress of conquered territories toward goals that no longer served any purpose. The psychological horror of their situation became apparent to outside observers who retained normal human consciousness. The manufactured eunuchs weren't suffering from their circumstances because they had been designed to find fulfillment only through the execution of predetermined tasks. As long as they could perform some version of their programmed functions, they remained content, even as the world they had been created to serve disappeared around them. But their contentment made their situation more disturbing, not less. They represented the ultimate success of Byzantine psychological engineering, human beings so thoroughly modified that they could remain satisfied even as everything that gave their existence meaning was systematically destroyed. They were proof that consciousness itself could be edited to eliminate inconvenient responses to trauma and loss. The Crusader occupation government eventually decided that the manufactured eunuchs posed too great a problem to integrate into new administrative structures. They were too psychologically inflexible to serve Western masters effectively, but too perfectly loyal to be safely released into the general population. They had become obsolete human beings, designed for a world that no longer existed. The final disposition of these manufactured servants remains one of history's darkest footnotes. Crusader records suggest they were relocated to isolated monasteries where they could continue performing meaningless administrative tasks without interfering with actual governance. There, cut off from any possibility of meaningful service, they apparently continued their programmed behaviors until death, processing imaginary documents and maintaining phantom bureaucracies with perfect dedication. The manufactured eunuchs died as they had lived, following procedures that served no purpose, maintaining systems that protected nothing, demonstrating absolute loyalty to masters who had ceased to exist. They were the ultimate products of imperial cruelty and the ultimate proof of its fundamental emptiness. Their story serves as a warning about the logical endpoint of systems that prioritize control over humanity. The Byzantine Empire achieved perfect administrative obedience by creating beings who were no longer fully human. They solved the problem of resistance by eliminating the psychological capacity for resistance itself. But in doing so, they also eliminated the creativity, adaptability, and independent thought that made their empire worth preserving. The manufactured eunuchs weren't just victims of imperial brutality, they were monuments to it, living proof that human nature itself could be systematically dismantled and rebuilt according to political specifications. They demonstrated that the qualities people consider essentially human, consciousness, creativity, moral reasoning, independent thought, are actually contingent and modifiable, but their existence also proved the ultimate futility of such modifications. Perfect servants are perfectly useless when perfection is no longer sufficient. Absolute loyalty becomes absolutely meaningless when there's nothing left worth being loyal to. The manufactured eunuchs achieved everything their creators intended, and in doing so, they revealed the fundamental emptiness of their creator's vision. The Byzantine Empire's treatment of its eunuchs represents more than historical cruelty. It represents a systematic exploration of the boundaries of human nature, a centuries-long experiment in discovering how thoroughly human consciousness could be modified while preserving the appearance of humanity. The manufactured eunuchs were the final results of that experiment, beings who looked human but had been systematically stripped of everything that made humanity meaningful. Their story reminds us that the most horrific acts aren't always the most obviously brutal ones. Sometimes the greatest cruelty lies not in destroying human beings, but in remaking them so thoroughly that they lose the capacity to recognize their own destruction. The manufactured eunuchs were perfectly content with their fate because they had been designed to be incapable of conceiving any alternative. And perhaps that's the most disturbing lesson of all. That human consciousness is more fragile and modifiable than we like to believe. That the qualities we consider essentially human can be systematically eliminated while leaving behind something that still looks and sounds human but lacks humanity's essential characteristics. The Byzantine Empire's manufactured eunuchs serve as a permanent warning about what we risk losing when we prioritize control over the preservation of human nature itself. In the end, the most horrific acts the Byzantine emperors committed against their eunuchs weren't the tortures, executions, or creative punishments we began with. Those were merely brutal. The truly horrific act was the systematic elimination of human nature itself, the transformation of living beings into organic machines that could perform human functions while lacking human consciousness. That was the ultimate cruelty, and its consequences outlasted the empire that created it.